So Helen Steel is our first speaker, and Helen Steel recently has written a book with 4 other women. And the book is called Deep Deception, and this is a copy of the book. It is massively recommended. It's a fantastic book. It details their experiences of being deceived into intimate sexual relationships by undercover police officers who were spying on political movements in the UK, and how they and 3 other women launched a groundbreaking case against the police to expose and seek to stop serious human rights abuses being committed by the police. In 2015, the women received an unprecedented apology from the police for these abuses. Helen became politically active as a teenager, campaigning on a range of environmental and social justice issues, including feminism. In the 1990s, she fought a high-profile court case with Dave Morris after being sued for libel by McDonald's Corporation over a leaflet criticising the company. The MacLibel trial became the longest trial in English legal history. The legal battle finally ended in 2005 with a ruling from the European Court of Human Rights that the trial had breached Helen and Dave's right to freedom of expression and a fair trial. In 2017, after Helen stepped in to stop the harassment of 2 women distributing feminist leaflets at the London Anarchist Book Fair, Helen was surrounded by trans activists who demanded she leave and shouted abuse at her for over an hour. Since that time, Helen has been kicked out of other events and has been ostracized by many former friends and colleagues for challenging the sexism of gender identity politics. Over to you, Helen, and welcome.
I was going to start by talking about my experiences being deceived into a 2-year relationship with an undercover policeman who I knew as John Barker, but whose real name was John Dines. Then I'll talk a bit about the process of finding out the truth about who he was, and then taking legal action with other women against the police to try and stop these abusive relationships from happening again. Through that process and through sharing our experiences of the deceit by these men, we came to recognise what we had assumed were individual actions and behaviours by the officers actually demonstrated patterns that could only have come from some kind of training and institutional sexism. After that, I'll talk a little bit about the public inquiry into undercover policing, which is now underway, including some of the information that has emerged from that about police spying on feminist groups and campaigns over the last 5 decades. And just really, it's good to be alert to the possibility that any campaign that you're involved with could be infiltrated either by the police or by private companies. Just to note that in the MacLibel case, some of the evidence in that case was obtained by private detectives infiltrating the group, or by journalists, all of whom may seek to undermine or redirect your campaigns to stop you achieving your aims. So while it's important to be aware of the fact that you could be infiltrated, it's also important not to let the fear of infiltration stop you from taking action, because that's exactly what they want you to do. They want you to be frightened to try and achieve anything. And if we don't try, we definitely won't achieve anything. So I became politically active as a teenager in the 1980s, initially campaigning for animal rights and environmental sustainability, and then also against war, sexism, racism, and other forms of oppression and exploitation. In 1987, I started attending the meetings of London Greenpeace, which was a broadly environmental and anti-capitalist group which held protests in the City of London against the arms trade, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and it was also the group that initiated the very popular worldwide anti-McDonald's campaign, which led to the MacLibel case that Joe mentioned that I fought. At this group, I met John, who turned out to be the undercover policeman. He had a van and he used to offer to drive people home, which is actually a very common tactic of undercover agents because it means that they can find out where people live. I was usually the last to be dropped off, and so we'd end up chatting about our backgrounds as well as our politics. I'd known John for about 3 years before we started a relationship, and in that time he'd become quite a close friend, sharing lots of his stories about personal issues like the death of his parents, being an only child, losing all his possessions when his van was stolen shortly after he moved to the UK. He asked me out several times, and eventually we ended up in a relationship not long after. He had told me that his mum had died and he needed to borrow money to get to New Zealand for the funeral. In reality, his mum was still alive, and so was his dad, and he also had brothers and sisters. So all of those stories that he told me, seeking my empathy and involvement in his life, they were totally false, and they were obviously a deliberate process of emotional manipulation. We ended up moving in together. He told me that he wanted to have children with me and he wanted to spend the rest of his life with me. Then after a short period of kind of bliss, he appeared to be going through some sort of mental breakdown, and he then disappeared from my life, leaving me bereft and also extremely concerned for his well-being. I searched for him, but I kept hitting brick walls, and everything I investigated turned out to be false. Eventually, in the course of that search, I discovered that he'd actually been using the identity of a child who died aged 8. And at that point, my life really fell apart. You know, if the person who I thought I knew and trusted the most could turn out to be fake, and I didn't even know his name, how could I trust anyone else around me or even trust my own judgment? I continued searching and eventually discovered his marriage certificate, and he'd actually been married at the time we were in a relationship. I tried to raise the alarm with a few people who I felt I could trust, but they suggested, especially my dad suggested, that there were probably less exciting reasons for his deceit than being a police spy, and that wouldn't happen in this country. And he seemed to suggest that I was becoming paranoid. Despite trying to continue with my investigations to kind of prove that he'd been an undercover policeman, the trail went cold and I couldn't find out the truth. And yeah, I kind of eventually gave up, really. It wasn't until 2010 that I finally gained confirmation that my ex-partner had been an undercover policeman. I was contacted by another woman who had also been deceived into a relationship by a different undercover officer. He had also disappeared, but she'd succeeded in tracking him down. Unfortunately for her, that success then led to a second round of deceit, and she ended up having 2 children with him before escaping to a domestic violence refuge. And then eventually she was able to get a message to me to tell me the truth about my ex-partner. Around this time, another woman called Lisa had investigated her partner, Mark Stone, and he was then exposed as a police spy named Mark Kennedy, who had infiltrated environmental groups for about 7 years. When this story broke in the media, Kennedy was portrayed by the police as a rogue officer who'd gone off the rails. But by then I was aware of 4 more officers who had abused women in this way, and I felt it was important that we take action to expose it by taking legal action against the police and trying to prevent it from happening to other women. We sought advice from lawyers, and in 2011, 8 of us got together to sue the Metropolitan Police, represented by Harriet Wistrich, who now works at the Centre for Women's Justice and indeed helped set it up. Our case involved 8 women deceived by 5 different undercover officers, and with all the relationships together spanning a period of about 25 years, which demonstrated that it was, systemic. Well, it demonstrated the systemic nature of the abuse, that it wasn't just individual officers to blame. Through coming together and discussing our experiences, we discovered that what had seemed like individual sob stories and emotional outbursts from the men were repeated patterns of behaviour that could only have come through a training programme. And to us, this highlighted the lengths the state was prepared to go to prevent change, and it represented institutional sexism, that you know, they could think it was okay to abuse women and derail our lives just to shore up the fake identities of these undercover policemen. We fought with the case. We had repeated applications by the police to have our case thrown out of court, but eventually in 2015 the police were forced to pay us damages and to make an unprecedented apology in which they admitted that the relationships were a gross violation of our rights and amounted to serious human rights abuses. I think the link will be posted to the police apology, which is actually well worth a listen. It's really quite, you know, it's really quite shocking. Our book goes into much more detail about the relationships and also about fighting the case and trying to expose this scandal. Moving on to the public inquiry into undercover policing, in 2014, the Home Secretary announced a public inquiry into undercover policing to investigate the actions of these secret political police units, which included the abusive undercover relationships that we had exposed. And it also was to look into the revelations by the police whistleblower, Pete Francis, that the police had spied on the grieving family and friends of the murdered black teenager Stephen Lawrence, rather than investigating the racist murderers. The inquiry opened in 2015, but it actually only started hearing evidence in 2020. It's been beset by delays caused by police demands for secrecy. But what we do know is that over 1,000 groups were spied on in the UK. The inquiry has so far refused to name most of them, but we do know that the vast majority were left-wing groups. There were only a handful of right-wing groups, and we do know that the groups spied on include women's groups as well as trade unions, anti-racist campaigns, family justice campaigns, peace campaigns, and environmental groups. Campaigners have been fighting for the release of the cover names used by the officers. Despite this, the inquiry has released less than half the cover names. But without the cover names being disclosed, that means the people spied on can't give evidence to the inquiry about what the officers did. So it can't really get a true picture of what happened. And it also means that other women won't also be able to find out that they were deceived by these officers. When we started our case, there were 8 women involved, and we knew of a handful more. But now, with further research by campaigners and the release of some of the cover names of officers by the public inquiry, we know that more than 50 women have been deceived into relationships by undercover police officers in these secret political policing units. On the Police Spies Out of Lives website, there is actually a link to a timeline of all the officers who had relationships with women. The first officers gave evidence in November 2020 about their deployments, and more recently, in May this year, more senior officers have given evidence, you know, about their management of the units. In the main, they have all been fairly evasive about who knew what about the relationships. Managers did give evidence that it was considered essential for undercover officers to have what they called stability and anchor. And so almost all of the officers were married men, which in theory gave them something to come back to and was supposed to prevent them from temptation. But really, there's, you know, I mean, through our case and through the evidence in the inquiry, there's some really shocking evidence of institutional misogyny. One officer in particular gave a shocking response that he said, "I have, if you like, a phrase in my head which helps guide me here." This is in relation to whether officers should have relationships with women undercover. "I have, if you like, a phrase in my head which helps guide me here. If you ask me to infiltrate some drug dealers, you can't point the finger at me if I sample the product." if these people are in a certain environment where it's necessary to engage a little more deeply, then shall we say, I find this acceptable. Basically, they're comparing deceiving women into sex and relationships with sampling a drug. Perhaps realizing that he dropped a clanger, he went on to say that he did worry about the consequences for the female and any children that may result from the relationships. These units were recording a great volume of information about people that they were spying on. Some seriously personal information. Just to give the first example, it reports that since that time she has been unattached until recently, when she formed a relationship with a bus conductor and the number of the bus is redacted, called, and it gives his name, but that's redacted for privacy reason, and it says that he's a black belt karate exponent. And she says, and the report goes on to say, and it is likely that this liaison will blossom, although the two characters prefer at present to maintain their independence. However, she still lives at, and then her address is redacted, and in the last week has intimated that she wishes to fall pregnant again, and for this purpose has ceased to take the pill on a regular basis. She is, however, not quite sure at the present as to who will sire this latest socialist offspring. So you can see there just really shockingly intrusive information recorded about a woman just because they're spying on the group. So to kind of move on to the spying that we're aware of so far on the women's liberation movement. So far, the inquiry has only heard evidence relating to the period between 1968 and 1982. But as part of that, we've had disclosed some special branch reports, including the special branch report for 1971. A number of the groups that were reported on as at this point in time, the special demonstration squad was actually called the Special Operations Squad, which you'll see from the initials SOS at the top. And then at the bottom of that list of groups being spied on, actually it's the penultimate one. There are more on another page, I couldn't fit them all on, but you'll see the Women's Liberation Front appears there. This reports here that the current strength of the Special Operations Squad, and then it includes 2 women detective constables, and then in the second paragraph it talks about having been established for a little over 3 years and providing intelligence on demonstrations and so-called extremist organisations, together with general information about persons and groups who have participated or are likely to participate in these activities. It says that the arrival of a second woman officer has added considerably to the squad's flexibility and has proved invaluable in the comparatively recent field of women's liberation. So this seems to be when they started reporting on the women's liberation movement. We've heard evidence at the inquiry from an undercover officer called Sandra Davis that she was recruited to infiltrate the Women's Liberation Front between 1971 and 1973. She attended the weekly meetings held in campaigners' private homes that were attended by about 10 people. And as she gained trust, she became the treasurer of the group's main committee, whose meetings were also held in private homes and attended only by around 5 people. Despite this, she continued to spy on the group for over 2 years. Sandra said she was recruited to the Special Demonstration Squad by Peter Imbert, who was at that point in time the head of the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, but who then went on to become the Metropolitan Police Commissioner in the 1980s. Sandra said that, quote, women's liberation was viewed as a worrying trend at the time. There was a very different view towards the women's movement then as compared to today. She gave evidence that at the time, the Women's Liberation Front mainly campaigned for equal pay, free contraception, and free nurseries. She said that as a constable, she had the same powers and responsibilities as her male colleagues, but as a female officer, she was only paid 90% of the men's salary. it's really quite incredible that she's doing her bit to undermine the campaign for equal pay. She reported on the Women's Liberation Front on such kind of mundane things as supplying homemade sweets and cakes for a children's Christmas party organised by the Black Unity and Freedom Party. She also reported on the Women's Liberation Front holding a jumble sale, and both of these reports were copied to MI5. The inquiry has revealed that a lot of this, the intelligence gained, was actually passed on to MI5, and that's actually recorded in the side of some of the documents where it refers to Box 500, which was the code name for MI5. Sandra also infiltrated women's rights conferences across the country, recording all sorts of things from their debates. There's an example of the Women's Liberation Conference in Derbyshire in November 1971. These are actually lengthy reports that can be read in their entirety on the Undercover Policing website. You need to do a search for women's liberation or look for the evidence of Sandra Davies, and they should be listed under that. Here she reports on the Women's Liberation Conference in Guildford in Surrey in June 1972, where she records that they were a group of fairly moderate women with no particular political motivation who have recently been campaigning for nurseries in the Guildford area. You know, it's really quite a shocking thing to be reporting on. This is in November 1972. She's attending the National Women's Liberation Conference in London, and here she reports to her superiors, quotes, "Lesbian friends in particular made exaggerated and noisy displays of affection, openly kissing and hugging each other. These displays were commonplace throughout the conference, and it was not unusual to see two girls entwined in a corner. That little notice was taken by the majority of the women present indicated the prevailing liberal attitude." It is, I don't know, I find it quite astounding that all this is getting reported. There's another entertaining bit in the 8th slide that talks about, actually it's towards the end of that bit. It says men were regarded as unnecessary, and then it says about test tube babies being reviewed as the future means of reproduction. And just as something else I spotted only today, I'd missed this before. If you go to slide 9, it talks about entertainments after the event, and it talks about some films being shown. And then it said, after this, the social commenced. It consisted of a record player which supplied the music and several kegs of beer and cider which supplied the mood. Several hundred women attended this function, and although no men were allowed in, 2 transvestite men managed to gain entrance. Unfortunately, their presence was discovered, and they were unceremoniously ejected amidst uproar. The social eventually ended at midnight. Anyway, Sandra basically admitted to the inquiry that she did not think her work had really yielded any good intelligence, although she claimed that it was beneficial in the sense that it helped her superiors conclude that the Women's Liberation Front didn't pose any threat to public order. She admitted that her deployment had failed to uncover any evidence of criminal activity, which is supposedly their motive for infiltrating these groups. And she said she felt she could have been doing much more worthwhile things with her time. Other women's groups that we know were infiltrated include Women's Voice, which was an organisation and newspaper of socialist women, which started in the summer of 1972 and continued until 1982, and which held meetings and rallies of up to 1,000 people. We know that the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp was infiltrated by a woman called Catherine Leslie or Lee Bonser, that's her pseudonym rather than her real name, between 1983 and 1987. The public inquiry has said that this deployment is of significant interest to the inquiry because the group was non-violent and posed no serious threat to public order. And it's also understood that another undercover officer infiltrated the Greenham women. Obviously, we've only got as far as 1982, and actually there's now a 2-year delay until the next round of evidence, which covers the period from 1982 to 1992, which won't start, the evidence in that won't start until 2024. Another group that we know was infiltrated was the Aldermaston Women's Peace Camp between 2002 and 2008, which was infiltrated by another officer called Lynn Watson, well, that's a pseudonym again, who was working for, this time, a different unit set up in 2008 called the National Public Order Intelligence Unit. The Women's Peace Camp were protesting against nuclear weapons, a nuclear weapons base at Aldermaston in Berkshire for many years. And in 2004, Lynn Watson pretended to be a campaigner and made friends with the protesters. Evidence from these officers has not yet been heard, but there is actually some limited information about them on the public inquiry website in relation to their applications for anonymity. Just kind of moving up to sum up on, the police tactics and so on. Political undercover policing should be seen as part of a wider effort by those in power to control the way we think and to prevent the spread of alternative ideas, basically because they want to hang on to their power and control. And, for that reason, that's why they were spying on women, and that's why undoubtedly they will want intelligence on what the women's movement is doing now too, so that it doesn't challenge their power too much. They act to, well, they do undermine opposition to the status quo by spreading by spreading division. A lot of these officers would badmouth other campaigners and create divisions within groups, or just the fact that, if you were doing an occupation or something like that, then, if the police knew about it in advance, the occupation wouldn't be successful, and then everyone would feel demoralized. They use information that they gain, deeply personal information, such as that recorded about the woman supposedly wanting to get pregnant and who she was in a relationship with. They use that to create division, but also to use in potential smear campaigns if it suits their purposes. And the whole purpose of this is to make everyone feel that change is impossible, that there's no point in even trying. But looking back through history, states have always tried to suppress movements for social change, as we've seen a few of the slides just now. But the first cameras that were bought by Special Branch in this country were actually used to create files on the suffragettes. We know that Nelson Mandela was labelled a terrorist and put in prison for fighting something so obviously wrong as apartheid, as were so many other people fighting racism, sexism and other injustices. And it's important that everyone's aware of the efforts by the state and powerful institutions to undermine movements for social progress, so that we can learn how to resist those methods. But it's also important not to let our own fear or suspicion of others undermine our efforts too, because their purpose is to undermine and control dissent in order to keep the status quo. And while it can be a hard battle to resist the temptation not to be able to trust anyone, it is important that we try. Otherwise, we end up undermining ourselves and doing their jobs for them. We can actually take heart from the fact, in some ways, that they infiltrate our campaigns, because it shows that they know that we can and do have an effect when we communicate with each other about the change we want to see in the world. Those who hold power continually put huge effort and resources into preventing change, and it's important for us to continually organise to improve the world and to fight for a more just and sustainable world. And I think we can take heart from the fact that despite the efforts of the state to undermine previous campaigns such as the suffragettes and the anti-apartheid movement and the civil rights movement, ultimately those campaigns did achieve massive improvements, so we shouldn't feel defeated. There's more information there's 3 different websites particularly. We set up a group, Police Spies Out of Lives, to support the women deceived into relationships. And there's also the campaign opposing police surveillance, which does reports about what's coming out at the public inquiry and the campaigns against the spying. And then there's Undercover Research Net, which has information about the individual officers and the campaigns that they were spying on. So all of those 3 sources are a good place to look for information, plus the public inquiry website as well, although that's a little bit difficult to get your head around. But anyway, the screenshots that were up are all from documents that have come out through the public inquiry. A lot of it was through the evidence of the policewoman Sandra Davies, but some of it is just through other reports that have been disclosed that are not necessarily attributable to any witness. There's probably there will be a gap now because there's no more evidence to be heard until 2024. But there will be a lot more evidence about the women's liberation movement and other campaigns that were spied on coming out over the coming years. And if you were involved in any political movements between 1968 and 82, it's well worth looking on the inquiry website for what's up there already, and then making contact if you think you were spied on with make contact with one of those groups.